Behind every story lies a truth waiting to be uncovered. Click subscribe and let's uncover it together. Margaret Lane had always believed in the quiet power of education. For 35 years, she poured her heart into teaching English at Jefferson High, a modest public school in the heart of a working-class town. She was the kind of teacher who carried a box of granola bars in her desk for hungry students, who stayed late to help those struggling with essays, who spent her own money on supplies when the budget fell short. But in the eyes of the world, Margaret was invisible. The parents rarely remembered her name at graduation ceremonies. The school board never recognized her decades of dedication, and her colleagues, many younger, more ambitious, dismissed her as just an old English teacher. Even worse, her own family didn't value her sacrifices. Her brother, who worked in finance, mocked her meager salary, and her sister often sneered, "You should have done something with your life." The truth was, Margaret had done something with her life. She had shaped lives. Yet in the unforgiving world of status and wealth, no one seemed to care. She lived alone in a modest rented apartment, her furniture mismatched, her savings barely enough for retirement. Every morning she walked past gleaming office buildings filled with professionals in tailored suits, wondering if she had failed somehow. At faculty meetings, when new initiatives were announced, she noticed how often the administration overlooked her, calling on younger teachers instead. The respect she once commanded had quietly evaporated. Still, she stayed. She stayed for the kids, the ones who came from broken homes, who needed someone to believe in them, who found in her classroom a refuge from chaos. Margaret knew most of them would forget her name after graduation, and she had made peace with that. Or at least she thought she had. But the years weighed heavily on her. As retirement loomed, Margaret couldn't help but reflect on her life with an aching sense of invisibility. No awards hung on her walls. No savings account gave her security. No family photos brought her joy. She had given the world her best, but what did she have to show for it? One evening, after a long day of grading papers, Margaret sat alone at her kitchen table, sipping tea that had long gone cold. She flipped through old yearbooks, scanning the faces of students she had once taught. Some of them had written short notes in the margins. "Thank you for believing in me. You made me love reading again. I'll never forget your class." For a moment, her heart swelled with warmth. But then reality set in. Those words were sweet, yes, but fleeting. Did any of them truly remember her now? Did her sacrifices matter at all in a world that only seemed to honor money, fame, and power? The next day, Margaret faced a moment that nearly broke her spirit. At a faculty luncheon, she overheard two younger teachers whispering, "Is she really still here? When is she going to retire?" one said, rolling her eyes. "She's just outdated. The kids don't connect with her anymore," the other replied with a shrug. Margaret lowered her gaze, forcing a smile as she stirred her soup. But inside, the words cut deep. Outdated, forgotten, irrelevant. On her walk home that evening, the city lights blurred through her tears. She passed by restaurants filled with laughter, boutiques glowing with promise, and families strolling hand in hand, and she wondered, what would it feel like to be seen? To be valued? That night, she whispered a prayer into the quiet of her empty apartment. "Please let my life have meant something." She didn't know it then, but her prayer was about to be answered in a way she could never have imagined. Somewhere out in the world, one of her former students had not forgotten her. In fact, that student, now one of the most powerful entrepreneurs in the country, was about to change Margaret Yes's life forever. But for now, Margaret went to bed with the same aching loneliness that had followed her for years. She closed her eyes, believing she was just a forgotten teacher, destined to fade quietly into obscurity. Little did she know, her story was only beginning. While Margaret struggled with feelings of invisibility, across the country another story was quietly unfolding, one that would soon collide with hers. Ethan Carter had been one of Margaret's students more than 2 decades ago. Back then, he was just another boy lost in the shuffle, skinny, quiet, with the same tattered sweatshirt worn nearly every day. Teachers often dismissed him as unmotivated or distracted. Few bothered to ask why he came to class hungry or why his homework was scrawled in the margins of scrap paper. But Margaret had noticed. She remembered the day he lingered after class, too embarrassed to admit he hadn't eaten breakfast. Without making a fuss, she had slipped him a granola bar and said, "Ethan, don't ever let hunger stand in the way of learning." She had stayed after school to help him with essays, telling him he had a voice worth hearing. And when he doubted himself, she would remind him, "Your circumstances don't define you. Your choices do." Those words never left him. Ethan grew up in a neighborhood where dreams were often crushed before they had a chance to bloom. Many of his childhood friends ended up dropping out, some tangled in crime, others stuck in dead-end jobs. But Ethan clung to the belief that he could be different. Margaret's encouragement was the spark that lit his determination. Through relentless hard work, Ethan won a scholarship to college, the first in his family to do so. He worked nights at a diner, studied until dawn, and pushed himself to graduate with honors. After college, he started tinkering with small tech projects, coding apps from his tiny apartment. Investors laughed at him. Competitors mocked him. He heard the same words Margaret once had: invisible, irrelevant, destined to fail. But Ethan carried something they didn't see, an unshakable belief, planted long ago by a teacher who had told him he mattered. Years passed. His small startup grew. One app turned into a platform. One investor turned into dozens. By his mid-30s, Ethan Carter was no longer the hungry boy in a worn sweatshirt. He was a billionaire tech entrepreneur, featured on magazine covers, interviewed on national television. And yet, success hadn't erased the past. At a gala one evening, Ethan was asked by a journalist, "Who inspired you most on your journey?" Without hesitation, he said, "My high school English teacher, Mrs. Lane. She believed in me when no one else did. Without her, I wouldn't be here." The audience clapped politely, but Ethan noticed the puzzled looks. No one in that glamorous ballroom knew her name. To them, she was just a teacher, but to him, she was everything. As Ethan's wealth grew, so did his desire to give back. He started foundations, funded scholarships, and invested in community programs. But in the back of his mind, there was always one lingering thought: what happened to Mrs. Lane? One evening, scrolling through old photos online, Ethan stumbled upon a faded yearbook page. There she was, Margaret Lane, smiling gently, holding a stack of books. A wave of gratitude washed over him. And then guilt. Had he ever truly thanked her? Did she even know what she meant to him? Determined, Ethan began searching. He contacted Jefferson High, only to learn that Margaret was still teaching, still quietly giving her life to students, still overlooked, still underpaid. The news stunned him. While he was closing million-dollar deals, the woman who had lit the fire in him was eating dinner alone in a modest apartment. That night, Ethan made a decision. It wasn't enough to send a thank you note or a bouquet of flowers. No, Margaret deserved more. She deserved the world to see her the way he saw her. She deserved to know that her sacrifices had changed history. So Ethan began to plan. It started with small things: anonymous donations to the school library in her honor, grants written in her name. But he knew the gesture had to be bigger, something undeniable, something that would lift her out of the shadows forever. He decided he would find her, face to face, and tell her the truth. And more than that, he would give her a gift that matched the magnitude of her impact on his life. Ethan Carter, billionaire, innovator, and CEO, owed everything to a forgotten teacher. And now, he was about to make sure she would never be forgotten again. The autumn air carried a quiet chill as Margaret Lane left Jefferson High School late one evening. The hallways were empty, lockers silent, the faint smell of floor wax lingering as the janitor worked his way down the corridor. Margaret clutched a worn leather bag filled with ungraded essays. Her car was old, its heater barely working, and she knew another long night of lesson planning awaited her. Despite the fatigue, she told herself, as she always did, "My students are worth it." But even the most devoted hearts sometimes grow weary of invisibility. That night, however, the course of her life was about to shift. Ethan Carter's Blacktown car pulled up just across the street. His driver glanced at him. "Are you sure you don't want me to go in with you, sir?" Ethan shook his head. "This is something I have to do myself." He stepped out, dressed not in his usual tailored suit, but in a simple sweater and jeans. The billionaire wanted no barriers, no pretense. Tonight, he wasn't the CEO, the man on magazine covers. He was just Ethan, the boy who had once sat in room 212, nervously handing over essays covered in red ink and encouragement. He spotted her immediately. Time had softened her posture, and silver strands framed her face, but the way she balanced the heavy bag on her shoulder was unmistakable. His heart clenched. She hasn't changed, still carrying everyone else's weight. Ethan called out, his voice hesitant yet warm. "Mrs. Lane?" Margaret froze, startled. Slowly she turned, her eyes narrowing in confusion. At first, she didn't recognize the man walking toward her. But then, something in his smile, the tilt of his head, the spark in his eyes, unlocked a memory. "Ethan?" she whispered, almost not believing. He grinned, suddenly the boy she had once known. "It's me, Ethan Carter, from your English class." Her hand flew to her mouth. "Good heavens. Ethan Carter? I haven't seen you in— Oh my, it must be 20 years." Ethan laughed softly. "Closer to 25? They stood for a moment in silence, two lives reconnecting across decades. Then Margaret shook her head in amazement. "Look at you. I heard about Ethan Carter, the tech genius, but I never imagined that was you." Ethan's voice grew tender. "None of it would have happened without you." Margaret blinked, her teacher's instinct kicking in. "Now that's nonsense. You did the work. I just corrected your grammar." But Ethan's eyes glistened. "No, Mrs. Lane. You gave me something no one else did. You gave me belief. When everyone else looked at me like I was nothing, you treated me like I mattered. That saved me." Margaret felt her throat tighten. In all her years, rarely had anyone acknowledged her sacrifices. Tears stung her eyes, unbidden. "Ethan, you don't know how much that means to hear." They walked together to a nearby cafe. The tables were nearly empty, and Margaret sat across from Ethan, still marveling at the man her former student had become. "So tell me everything," she said. "How did the boy in the tattered sweatshirt become, well, you?" Ethan smiled, recounting his journey. The scholarship, the diner shifts, the coding projects that seemed like foolish dreams until they weren't. As he spoke, Margaret listened intently, pride radiating from her tired features. When he finished, she sighed. "I always knew you had it in you. I'm so proud, Ethan. Truly." He leaned forward. "Mrs. Lane, I didn't come here just to reminisce. I came because I need you to know something. I've carried your words with me every step of the way, and I've realized it's time to give back what you gave me." Margaret frowned slightly, unsure. "Ethan, I don't need anything. My joy has always been in my students. Seeing them succeed, that's more than enough." But Ethan shook his head gently. "It's not enough for me. Do you know what it feels like to owe someone your life and never repay it? You gave me hope when I had none, and now it's my turn." Margaret thought he was exaggerating. She chuckled lightly, waving a hand. "Don't be ridiculous. I'm just an old teacher doing her job." But Ethan's gaze didn't waver. "No, you're the reason a scared boy believed he could be more than his circumstances, and the world should know it." Margaret's eyes searched his, trying to measure his sincerity. What she saw left her both overwhelmed and speechless. Pure gratitude, unshaken devotion. For the first time in decades, she felt truly seen. They left the cafe together, the night air brisk against their faces. Ethan walked her to her car. Margaret's old sedan groaned as the door opened, a sharp contrast to the sleek vehicles Ethan usually rode in. He noticed the worn tires, the cracked dashboard, the squeak in the door hinge. Something hardened in him. He thought, she deserves so much more. Margaret looked at him kindly, her teacher's voice returning. "Ethan, whatever you do now, whatever you think you owe me, just promise me this. Keep being kind. Keep helping others. That's all the repayment I could ever ask for." Ethan smiled, but inside he was already making plans far greater than she could imagine. As he watched her drive away, taillights flickering into the darkness, Ethan whispered to himself, "No, Mrs. Lane, That's not enough. The world is going to know who you are. The following week passed slowly for Margaret Lane. She went about her routine, grading essays at midnight, stretching every paycheck to cover bills, and telling herself that her work still mattered, even if the world rarely noticed. But in quiet moments, she found her thoughts drifting back to Ethan Carter. His sudden reappearance had unsettled her in the best of ways. For years, she had doubted whether she had ever made a real difference in her students' lives. Now, here was proof. A boy she once believed in had grown into a man who believed in her. Still, she dismissed his words about repayment as polite exaggeration. She had no expectation of anything more. Across the city, Ethan was working in secrecy. His penthouse boardroom looked nothing like the classrooms of Jefferson High. Massive windows framed the skyline, and assistants buzzed in and out with documents and reports. But at the center of it all, Ethan sat alone, poring over one folder. Project Gratitude. Inside were plans drafted by his team, legal paperwork, financial documents, architectural sketches. Everything was designed around one goal: honoring Margaret Lane. Ethan tapped his pen against the table, recalling her modest car, her tired hands, her humble insistence that she needed nothing. He smiled softly. She won't see this coming. The day of the unveiling began like any other for Margaret. She taught her morning classes, lecturing about Steinbeck and the American dream, though her students hardly grasped the irony of a weary teacher explaining broken dreams. At lunch, she was summoned unexpectedly to the principal's office. Her first thought was worry. Had she forgotten some deadline? Was there a complaint? Instead, the principal handed her a formal envelope. "Mrs. Lane, this came for you, hand-delivered." Margaret opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a simple note. "Dear Mrs. Lane, please meet me this evening at the Jefferson Community Center. Trust me. Ethan." Her heart pounded. She tried to shake it off, but curiosity gnawed at her until the final bell rang. That evening, she drove to the community center. To her surprise, the parking lot was filled with cars. Camera crews bustled about, bright lights illuminating a temporary stage set up in front of the building. Margaret froze. "What on earth?" A staff member spotted her. "Mrs. Lane, right this way." Before she could protest, she was ushered to the front row, just as Ethan stepped onto the stage. He wore no tie, no suit jacket, just a simple shirt, sleeves rolled to his elbows. The crowd hushed. Ethan spoke, his voice steady, yet charged with emotion. "Good evening, everyone. Tonight isn't about me. Tonight is about a woman who changed my life. When I was a kid, no one believed in me, not my family, not my peers, but there was one person who did. She taught me that words mattered, that effort mattered, and most of all, that I mattered. Her name is Margaret Lane." A spotlight swung to where Margaret sat, and the audience erupted in applause. She gasped, covering her mouth, overwhelmed. Ethan continued, his eyes locked on hers. "Mrs. Lane never asked for recognition. She worked quietly, year after year, shaping lives without fanfare. But I wouldn't be standing here today without her, and it's time the world knows it." He gestured to a massive banner behind him. It unfurled dramatically, revealing the words, "The Lane Foundation for Education." Margaret's knees went weak. Ethan explained, "I've established a foundation in Mrs. Lane's name, funded with $50 million to support teachers, provide scholarships, and ensure no student is overlooked the way I once was. This building, once forgotten, will now be transformed into the Margaret Lane Center for Learning, a space where students and educators alike can thrive." The crowd roared with cheers. Reporters snapped photos. Teachers in the audience wiped tears from their eyes. Margaret sat frozen, unable to comprehend. Finally, she whispered to herself, "This can't be real." Ethan stepped down from the stage and approached her. Kneeling slightly so their eyes met, he said softly, "Mrs. Lane, this is for you. For every late night you stayed up grading. For every word of encouragement. For every time you saw potential where no one else did. You gave me a future. Let me give something back." Margaret shook her head, tears streaming freely. "Ethan, I don't deserve this. I was just doing my job. He took her hands gently. No, you were doing far more than a job. You were shaping lives, mine included. The audience quieted, watching the intimate exchange. Margaret finally whispered, "Thank you, from the bottom of my heart." Ethan smiled. "Don't thank me. Just keep being who you are." The rest of the evening was a blur of interviews, congratulations, and awe. Margaret could hardly process it all. When she finally stood alone on the stage, looking at the banner with her name in bold letters, she felt something she had long thought impossible: seen, valued, honored. For decades, she had been invisible, a tired teacher with no accolades. Tonight, she realized her legacy would live on, not through test scores or dusty yearbooks, but through the generations who would walk through the doors of a center bearing her name. The overlooked had finally been recognized. For a few blissful days, Margaret Lane lived in a haze of disbelief. Everywhere she turned, someone was congratulating her. Former students sent messages, parents stopped her in the grocery store, and fellow teachers embraced her with tearful pride. The newspapers ran headlines like, "Billionaire honors teacher who changed his life." From classroom to legacy, the Lane Foundation. Her once quiet life had become a whirlwind of interviews, photographs, and applause. But admiration, as Margaret soon discovered, had a shadow. The first sign came during a staff meeting at Jefferson High. She walked in expecting smiles. Instead, a few colleagues glanced at her with thinly veiled resentment. "Well," one muttered, "looks like we've all been teaching wrong. Should have picked a future billionaire to babysit." Another added with a forced laugh, "Guess we're not worthy of a $50 million foundation." Margaret froze. The words stung more than she cared to admit. She wanted to protest, to insist she never asked for any of this. But the bitterness in the room was undeniable. That night, she sat at her kitchen table, staring at the glowing headlines on her laptop. The praise felt suddenly heavy, like a crown she never wanted to wear. Meanwhile, Ethan faced his own storm. Board members of his company demanded an explanation. $50 million? On a charity named after your high school teacher? One of them scoffed during a heated meeting. Shareholders are not philanthropists. They expect profits, not sentiment. Ethan remained calm, but his jaw tightened. "I built this company because someone believed in me when no one else did. If you think investing in future talent is a waste, perhaps you've forgotten what innovation is built on." The board exchanged uneasy glances. Ethan had the power to overrule them, but the tension was clear. Not everyone celebrated his generosity. The media, once glowing, began to shift tone. One headline read, "Hero teacher or lucky beneficiary." Another sneered, "Philanthropy or publicity stunt." Talk shows debated whether Ethan's gift was genuine gratitude or an elaborate PR move. Some commentators argued Margaret had been rewarded for doing her job, while others accused Ethan of using her as a symbol to distract from corporate controversies. Margaret saw it all. Each cruel word cut deeper than the last. One evening, after a particularly harsh news segment, she sat in her darkened living room, clutching a cup of tea gone cold. When the phone rang, she nearly didn't answer. It was Ethan. His voice was steady, but tinged with frustration. "Don't read the headlines, Mrs. Lane. They don't matter." She sighed. "Easy for you to say. You're used to being in the spotlight. I'm not. I was happy being invisible." He paused. "Do you regret it? The foundation? The center? Everything?" Margaret closed her eyes. "No, but I don't know how to carry it. I never asked to be the face of anything. I just wanted to teach." There was silence on the line. Then Ethan spoke softly. "Then let me carry it with you. You don't have to do this alone." But the pressure only grew. Within weeks, critics demanded to know why one teacher was honored while others were overlooked. Parents questioned whether the foundation would benefit their children or just serve as a vanity project. Journalists camped outside her modest home, shoving microphones at her whenever she stepped out. The worst blow came from a parent at a school board meeting. "My daughter's teacher works just as hard as Mrs. Lane," the woman snapped. "Where's her recognition? Why does this one teacher get millions while the rest scrape by? What makes her so special?" The room murmured in agreement. Margaret sat silently in the back, shrinking into her seat, wishing the ground would swallow her whole. That night, she broke down for the first time. Alone in her kitchen, she whispered through tears, "I never wanted this. I never wanted any of this." Her hands trembled as she thought of resigning, retreating, disappearing. Maybe if she stepped away, the attention would fade. Maybe then the resentment would stop. But even in her despair, one thought kept echoing in her mind. Ethan's words, "You gave me a future. Let me give something back." She realized this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the students who would benefit, the teachers who would be supported, the possibilities unlocked by the foundation. If she quit now, their chance might vanish. The next morning, Margaret looked at her reflection in the mirror. Her eyes were tired, but there was a spark of determination. For years, she had taught her students to stand tall in the face of adversity. Now, it was her turn to practice what she preached. She straightened her shoulders and whispered to herself, "They may not understand, but I know the truth, and so does Ethan." The backlash had shaken her, yes, but it would not break her. The morning after the storm of criticism, Margaret woke with swollen eyes from a restless night. For the first time in decades, she dreaded going to school. The thought of facing her colleagues, some envious, some resentful, made her stomach twist. But she forced herself to dress, to gather her lesson plans, and to walk into Jefferson High as if nothing had changed. When she entered the classroom, she found a surprise waiting for her. On her desk sat a small stack of letters tied with a red ribbon. Each envelope bore familiar handwriting, her students'. She untied the ribbon with trembling fingers. "Thank you for never giving up on me. Because of you, I believe I matter. You were the only one who saw my potential." Dozens of notes, heartfelt and raw. Tears filled her eyes as she read. Whatever the media said, whatever her colleagues whispered, these words were proof. She had made a difference. That was her truth. Later that week, she met Ethan at the construction site of the Margaret Lane Learning Center. The skeletal frame of the building rose from the ground, surrounded by scaffolding and busy workers. Ethan greeted her warmly, though his own face carried signs of exhaustion. "They're relentless," he admitted, referring to the critics. "Every move we make is questioned, but I refuse to let them twist this into something ugly." Margaret looked up at the rising structure. This isn't about us. It's about them, the kids who'll walk through those doors someday. We can't let noise drown out the purpose." Ethan studied her with quiet admiration. "You once told me to focus on what I could control, not on the voices telling me I'd fail. I think it's time you took your own advice." For the first time in weeks, Margaret smiled. The turning point came during a town hall meeting organized to discuss the foundation. The auditorium was packed. Parents, students, teachers, reporters, all buzzing with skepticism. Rumors had spread that the foundation was just a vanity project or a tax shelter. Tension filled the air. Margaret sat nervously in the front row until Ethan nudged her. "They need to hear from you," he whispered. Her pulse raced. Public speaking had never been her strength, but as she stepped onto the stage, something inside her steadied. She adjusted the microphone and began. "I was a teacher for 35 years. I never expected wealth. I never expected fame. What I wanted was simple, to see children believe in themselves." The crowd quieted. "When Ethan was in my class, he wasn't a billionaire. He was a boy who doubted his worth. I didn't do anything extraordinary. I simply believed in him, and he carried that belief into the world, where it grew into something extraordinary." She paused, scanning the audience, her voice firming. "This center isn't a gift for me. It's an investment in every child who feels invisible, in every teacher who works in the shadows, unrecognized. This is proof that what we do matters, that the smallest act of faith can change the world." Silence lingered, then applause broke like thunder. Parents stood, students cheered, even skeptical reporters clapped. The tide, at last, was turning. In the weeks that followed, Margaret embraced her role, not as a reluctant figurehead, but as a guardian of purpose. She visited classrooms, spoke at community events, and insisted the foundation support underfunded schools, scholarships, and teacher training. Every dollar was tied to her lifelong mission: education as empowerment. Her colleagues, once bitter, softened as they saw her use her influence to lift others rather than bask in the spotlight. Grants poured into Jefferson High, new supplies filled classrooms, and teachers received resources they'd only dreamed of. The resentment faded, replaced by respect. One afternoon, as construction neared completion, Margaret walked the halls of the new center with Ethan. Sunlight streamed through wide glass windows onto freshly painted walls. "Do you see it?" Ethan asked. "This is your legacy." Margaret shook her head gently. "No, Ethan. This is our legacy. Yours, mine, every student who dared to dream, every teacher who believed when it was hard. This building isn't my name carved in stone. It's hope carved into the future." Ethan smiled, his eyes bright. "Spoken like the teacher I remember?" The backlash hadn't disappeared completely. Critics would always exist, but Margaret no longer feared them. She had faced the doubt, the envy, the suspicion, and found her strength on the other side. For the first time since the whirlwind began, she felt peace. Not because she had silenced the critics, but because she had remembered who she was. A teacher, a believer in human potential, a quiet force for good. That night, she wrote in her journal, the same way she had for decades after each school day. Her words were simple, but they captured the turning point she had lived. "They may mock, they may question, but I know the truth. My life's work mattered, and now it will matter for generations." Margaret Lane, once overlooked, had found her voice, and the world was finally listening. The day of the grand opening arrived with crisp autumn air and a sky painted in gold and orange hues. A banner stretched across the entrance of the brand new building, the Margaret Lane Learning Center, a place where potential finds a voice. Margaret stood at the edge of the crowd, her heart pounding as hundreds gathered. Students, parents, teachers, city officials, even reporters. She clutched the small silver scissors in her hand, feeling the weight of the moment. Ethan, standing beside her, leaned down and whispered, "You deserve this. Every brick, every wall, every dream inside this place exists because of you." Margaret shook her head gently. "Because of us," she corrected. "Because someone believed and someone else carried that belief forward. This isn't mine. It belongs to every child who steps through those doors." When the ribbon was cut, the crowd erupted in cheers. Children rushed inside, their laughter echoing through the halls as they explored bright classrooms, tech labs, and reading corners filled with books. Teachers wept openly, marveling at the resources they had never dared to imagine. That evening, after the crowd dispersed, Margaret wandered through the quiet building. Her footsteps echoed against polished floors. In the library, she paused before a plaque mounted on the wall. It read, "Dedicated to Margaret Lane, whose faith in unseen potential lit the path for generations. May every child who enters here know that they are worthy, capable, and seen." Tears welled in her eyes. For 35 years, she had worked in the shadows, believing her life would fade quietly after retirement. But now, her legacy was carved not in wealth or fame, but in the future of countless lives. Weeks turned into months, and the center became a living testament to her values. Scholarships lifted struggling students into universities. After-school programs kept children safe and inspired. Teachers found renewed purpose, their classrooms supplied and supported. And Margaret? She no longer felt invisible, not because her name was on a building, but because her story had become a beacon. She was proof that even the most overlooked lives could ripple outward in ways unimaginable. Her once resentful colleagues now sought her advice. Parents approached her in grocery stores, thanking her for the opportunities the center had given their children. And every so often, she would receive a letter from a student, new or old, telling her that she had changed their life. One evening, Margaret sat with Ethan on the steps of the Learning Center. The sun was setting, bathing the building in amber light. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked softly. "The spotlight, the controversy, the noise?" Ethan shook his head. "Not for a second. Because look at what we built. Look at what you built. This isn't just a building, it's a movement. and movements are always bigger than the noise. Margaret smiled, her heart swelling with peace. She realized that the doubts, the criticism, the years of being overlooked, all of it had led to this. Her legacy wasn't just about her, it was about the countless lives still to be touched, long after she was gone. Her final journal entry for the year captured it best. I once thought my story would end quietly, that I would slip into the background, remembered by a few former students and no one else. But life has a way of surprising us. The seed we plant in the hearts of others can grow into forests we may never live to see. Today, I walked through those halls and saw not my name, but hope. And that is enough. That is everything. And so, Margaret's journey reminds us all. It's not always the loudest, the wealthiest, or the most powerful who change the world. Sometimes it's the quiet faith of a teacher, the resilience of the overlooked, and the belief that every soul has worth. If this story touched you, don't let it end here. Subscribe to Truth Unraveled for more powerful stories of resilience, betrayal, justice, and redemption. Like, share, and comment to keep these stories alive, because every voice deserves to be heard, and every truth deserves to be unraveled.